Well, Professor Gage, thank you very much. That's a tall order to decipher Donald Trump and explain everything in one short lecture, but thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you for that very generous introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here at Yale. I took the train from Boston. It's a beautiful day. This is a great campus, and I'm just reminded of that every time I come here. What a beautiful, historic campus this is. What a great university this is. No punchlines here. No Yale jokes are coming. I truly and sincerely mean this. And thanks to Professor Gage, we just had a short talk about her research. She's working on a book about J. Edgar Hoover, which I'm now anxious to read, having heard a little bit about that book and that great figure and controversial figure in some ways in American history. I'm also very honored, and I know there are members of the Walker family here, to give the George Herbert Walker Jr. Memorial Lecture. I served with his son, Ambassador Walker. When he was ambassador to Hungary, I was U.S. ambassador to NATO during President George W. Bush's first term in office, and I certainly am very proud to have served both President George W. Bush, but also President George H.W. Bush, President George Herbert Walker Bush, who was one of my heroes. And I arrived at the NSC staff at the White House in the spring of 1990, just before one of his summit meetings with President Mikhail Gorbachev. I was brought over by a young Stanford professor on the NSC staff by the name of Condoleezza Rice. I became her deputy, and we were the two-person Soviet team for President George H.W. Bush. What a great president he was. And if you just look back on his record, he helped to achieve the democratic peace in Europe at the end of the Cold War. He ended the Cold War without a shot being fired. Masterful diplomacy with Boris Yeltsin, Mikhail Gorbachev, Helmut Kohl. He and Secretary Jim Baker, who was a great Secretary of State, were the primary movers to unify Germany after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the opening of the wall, really. In 1990, when Germany was unified, they led the big coalition against Saddam Hussein, but then President George H.W. Bush had the good sense to be restrained in what he did. He accomplished his mission, but didn't try to occupy Baghdad. Great president. Very honored to be here with members of the Walker family and the Bush family, and to think of what the Bushes have done and the Walkers for America in public service. I know that George Herbert Walker Jr., graduate of Yale, was very civic-minded, very much involved at Yale in your alumni association on behalf of baseball. And such is my esteem for the Walker family that I even forgive them for helping to found the New York Mets, because the Mets broke my heart when they defeated my beloved Boston Red Sox in the 1986 World Series. But I forgive the Walkers officially for that today, and thank you to all the members who are here. I also realize I'm behind enemy lines of sorts, because I'm an emissary of the People's Republic of Cambridge, Massachusetts, here in New Haven. There's the Harvard-Yale thing that goes on, but we're really sister institutions. We have great respect for Yale at Harvard. I was just at the Yale-Harvard hockey game. We got the better of you there, the final game, but you got the better of us in Cambridge in football. That was a great game this past autumn. So two great institutions. And I'm very pleased to be here on behalf of one, speaking to all of you about one of your graduates. My task is difficult. It's to try to explain and decipher the foreign policy challenges that President Trump has inherited. We have very little to go on, 100 plus days, 103 or 4 days of his time in office, very early in his time of office. But I want to start by saying two things. The first is, I think America is in good shape as a global power. I don't share the conventional thought in some of our academic circles that somehow the United States has fallen from grace, or that somehow China is going to overtake us in the next month or two as the leading global power. I think we can be optimistic about the United States. We still have the leading global economy. It's the largest by GDP. It's certainly the most important in terms of innovation. And if you look at the 21st century strengths of any global economy, if you think of our strengths in nanotechnology, biotechnology, Boston's become one of the hubs of biotechnology globally, which we're very proud of. In the emerging digital age, our strengths in Austin, Texas, Research Triangle, North Carolina, here in New Haven, Silicon Valley, Boston, We're the world leader economically. We should be the world leader in the next digital age that is coming. And we should take some hope from that. We certainly militarily are still the strongest country in the world by a long mile. And whatever you think of our interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan in the last decade, and I supported them obviously as a member of the George W. Bush administration. I supported them at the time. Our American military acquitted itself honorably, effectively. They showed us, I thought, grit and determination. They achieved a lot, and they're still doing that. They're still out there. They're back in Iraq. They're in Syria. They're fighting a series of terrorist movements, really from the Horn of Africa all the way over to the west coast of Africa, in Mauritania and Mali. We can be proud of our military, and our military lead in terms of aggregate power. We spend more in our military, about $650 billion a year, by the way, of taxpayers' money, than the next 10 countries combined. And then I think of our diplomatic power, our political power, our ability to persuade, our influence in the world. We're not always the most popular country. I served as a diplomat in 5 different countries, in West Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. I was on the receiving end of my fair share of anti-Americanism, but they still call us when the chips are down. Whether it's the Indians and Pakistanis arguing over Kashmir, or the Israelis and Palestinians still calling now Jared Kushner to be the intermediary, the son-in-law of President Trump, who's been designated to be the emissary to those 2 countries. China and Taiwan. The United States has enormous political influence, and my colleague at Joe-Nye is this great professor at Harvard who's now just become an emeritus professor after 50-odd years teaching at our university. He coined the term soft power, that every country in the world has it. Mexico has a lot of soft power. The United States has a lot of soft power. In our case, it's probably a combination of Disney World and Silicon Valley. Our Constitution is amended. Martin Luther King and the tradition of civil disobedience. He redeemed the promise of America 100 years after the Civil War. When you go overseas, this is what people talk about when they admire the United States. We have a lot of that. So I wanted to begin on a hopeful note, because it is so fashionable to say that somehow our best days are over. Henry Luce said, this is the American century. I wouldn't be so arrogant or so bold to say that we're going to own the 21st century. Several countries will be powerful. We'll be, I think, primus inter pares, the most powerful country, I would think, the next 3 or 4 decades into the future. So we should take heart from that. And President Trump does not inherit a government or a country that's failing. And one of the things that bothered me, and I'll be an equal opportunity critic of our 2016 campaign, and I'll tell you, to be fully transparent, I was working for Secretary Clinton for 16 months in the campaign. I hoped she would win. I was bitterly disappointed when she lost. But it bothered me that when from the left, and 3 of my daughters and most of my students supported Bernie Sanders, but Bernie Sanders described an America that was failing. And then from the right, or from wherever he is on a given day on the political spectrum, President Trump, candidate Trump, also said, you know, he decried our trade agreements. He denigrated our alliances. He described a country and government that was failing, and that's not real. That's not the reality that I know from my time in government. We are highly imperfect, but we're still a great country with great values, a distinguished tradition in global affairs. We've made our fair share of mistakes in the last 15 or 20 years, particularly in our reaction to 9/11. I think that's clear. But we still have a lot to offer from the world. And I hope that President Trump values that and understands it as he goes forward to represent us on the global stage. I want to start there. That's the first thought. But the second thought is that this is a really complicated time in global history. And if we could just peer into the inbox of President Trump and on his Oval Office desk, I would say, but I've got to be a little bit careful, have an eminent historian sitting in the front row. I would say that this might be the most complex set of challenges internationally that any American president has faced since Franklin Delano Roosevelt during the Second World War. Might be. I didn't say, by the way, just 3 caveats with historians present. I did not say it's the most fateful time in American history. It's not. The Revolution was the most fateful time. It had to be. The existential moment. Will we succeed or fail? It's not the most dangerous time. That was clearly the South's rebellion against the Union in April 1860, and the battle over slavery and the preservation of the Union that Lincoln brilliantly preserved for us, won for us. And in an interesting sort of way, we think of the United States as this behemoth, this colossal power globally. We are, in many ways, but between 1942 and 1945, we had 16 million men and women in uniform, millions of them serving in the European, Middle Eastern, Pacific theaters as we fought the forces of fascism.